The evening sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Wilson's supermarket as Sheriff Maria Thompson pulled into an empty spot near the entrance. She hadn't planned on shopping after her shift, but the community outreach event was tomorrow, and she needed to pick up supplies. The dashboard clock read 7:45 p.m., just enough time before the store closed. Running her fingers through her curly hair, she glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror. She changed into her comfortable clothes after her shift, a simple navy blue t-shirt and jeans. Her badge and department ID were tucked safely in her purse, as they always were when she was off duty. 15 years on the force had taught her the importance of maintaining a low profile during personal time. As she walked through the automatic doors, the familiar coolness of the store's air conditioning welcomed her. The floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, recently mopped by the evening cleaning crew. A young cashier nodded hello, though she didn't recognize Maria out of uniform. That was fine by her. Sometimes it was nice to just be another face in the crowd. Maria grabbed a shopping cart, its wheel making a slight squeak that echoed through the relatively quiet store. She pulled out her phone, checking the list she'd made earlier: juice boxes, snacks, paper plates, napkins, and everything else needed for tomorrow's youth mentorship program. The department had been running these monthly events for years, bringing local kids together with law enforcement in a positive environment. As she navigated the aisles, her mind wandered to tomorrow's activities. They were expecting at least 30 children, mostly from the nearby middle school. She smiled, remembering last month's event where they taught the kids basic first aid. One little girl had been so excited about learning to properly wrap a bandage that she'd practiced on everyone she could find. The cart gradually filled with family-sized packages of cookies, boxes of fruit juice, and colorful paper goods. Maria took extra care selecting the snacks, making sure to include options for kids with allergies. It was these small details that often made the biggest difference, something she'd learned both as a law enforcement officer and as someone who truly cared about her community. Near the bread aisle, she bumped into Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman she'd helped last winter when her car had broken down during a cold snap. "Oh, getting ready for another community day?" Mrs. Chen asked, recognizing her despite the casual clothes. Maria nodded warmly, chatting briefly about the upcoming event. These were the moments she cherished most about her job, the genuine connections formed with the people she served. As she moved through the store, Maria noticed a few other late-night shoppers, a tired-looking dad with a toddler, a couple of college students loading up on energy drinks, and a man in a police uniform she didn't recognize. She didn't think much of it at first. There were several precincts in the area, after all. The store's overhead speakers crackled with the 15-minute warning before closing. Maria quickened her pace, heading to the snack aisle for the last few items. As she reached for a box of granola bars, she felt an odd sensation, like someone was watching her. Years of training had honed her instincts, but she brushed it off. Still, there was something unsettling about the atmosphere that hadn't been there moments before. Checking her list one final time, Maria headed toward the checkout lanes. Her cart was full, and tomorrow's event was going to be perfect. She couldn't help but feel proud of how far the community outreach program had come since she'd first proposed expanding it 5 years ago. What had started as simple meet and greets had grown into structured activities that genuinely helped bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. As she waited in line, Maria noticed the uniformed officer she'd seen earlier was now standing near the store's exit, occasionally glancing in her direction. Something about his posture seemed off, too rigid, too focused. But surely, she thought, he was just doing his job, maybe watching for shoplifters during the store's closing time. Little did she know that this routine shopping trip was about to become anything but ordinary, and the next few minutes would test everything she stood for as both a law enforcement officer and a human being. Officer James Parker wasn't having a good day. 3 weeks into his transfer to this precinct, and he still felt like an outsider. His previous department had different ways of doing things, and he missed the familiar faces and routines. The evening shift at the supermarket wasn't exactly his idea of exciting police work, but here he was, watching shoppers hurry through their last-minute purchases. That's when he first noticed her, a woman in casual clothes, pushing a cart loaded with snacks and supplies. Something about her movements caught his attention. Maybe it was the way she carefully studied each item before putting it in her cart, or how she seemed to be taking her time despite the store's approaching closing time. In his mind, these ordinary actions somehow transformed into suspicious behavior. Parker began following her at a distance, moving between aisles while trying to look inconspicuous. Each time she reached for an item, his suspicion grew. The cart was filling up with bulk purchases, multiple boxes of snacks, drinks, and paper goods. To most people, this would look like someone preparing for a party or event, but Parker had already made up his mind about what he was seeing. He noticed her talking to an elderly woman in the bread aisle, the conversation seeming friendly and natural. But instead of easing his suspicions, it only reinforced them. In his experience, he thought, people trying to avoid attention often acted extra friendly to blend in. The fact that she seemed so at ease only made him more convinced something wasn't right. The store's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Parker positioned himself near the exit. From here, he could watch her while pretending to monitor the whole store. He observed as she double-checked her shopping list, completely unaware of the trouble brewing. The tired dad with his toddler passed through the checkout without a second glance from Parker. The college students with their energy drinks walked right by him, but his eyes remained fixed on one shopper. As she moved toward the checkout line, Parker noticed more details that he used to justify his growing suspicion. Her clothing was casual but neat. Her purse was large enough to hold stolen items, though it wasn't unusually large at all. And she kept checking her phone. She was actually reviewing her shopping list. In his mind, perfectly normal behaviors were being twisted into something they weren't. The young cashier greeted her warmly, just like any other customer. The total came to over $200, and Parker watched intently as she pulled out her credit card to pay. The transaction went through without any issues, but he wasn't satisfied. He'd seen what he wanted to see, and nothing, not the legitimate purchase, not her calm demeanor, not her ordinary shopping behavior, was going to change his mind. Other customers were finishing up their shopping, the store getting ready to close for the night. The cleaning crew had started their end-of-day routine, the smell of floor cleaner mixing with the supermarket's usual scents. The overhead speakers announced 5 minutes until closing, creating a gentle rush of activity as the remaining shoppers headed to the checkout. Parker adjusted his uniform and straightened his badge, preparing himself for what he'd already decided would be a confrontation. He watched as she collected her receipt, thanked the cashier, and began pushing her cart toward the exit. Her groceries were properly bagged, her receipt was in hand, and everything about the situation was completely normal, except for the unfair assumptions that had taken root in Parker's mind. The automatic doors slid open, letting in a burst of evening air. The parking lot lights had come on, creating pools of yellow light between long shadows. Other shoppers walked to their cars, loading groceries, chatting about their days. It was a perfectly ordinary evening about to become extraordinary for all the wrong reasons. As she approached the exit, Parker stepped forward, his hand resting near his belt in what he thought was a subtle gesture of authority. The next few moments would reveal exactly how wrong assumptions and unchecked biases could spiral into a situation that would change multiple lives and spark a conversation the whole community needed to have. Little did Officer Parker know, his next actions would not only challenge his entire career, but would also force him to confront his own biases in a way he never expected. The simple act of stopping the shopper would set in motion events that would ripple through the entire department and community, leading to consequences he couldn't possibly imagine. "Excuse me, ma'am. I need you to stop right there." Officer Parker's voice cut through the quiet evening air. Maria Thompson paused, her shopping cart still half inside the store's automatic doors. The evening had suddenly shifted from routine to tense in just a few words. "Is there a problem, officer?" Maria asked calmly, years of law enforcement experience evident in her measured response. She noticed his nameplate and the precinct number on his uniform, not from her department, but one she worked with occasionally. Parker stepped closer, his posture stiff and authoritative. "I've been observing some suspicious behavior, and I need to check your receipt and bags." The fluorescent lights from the store cast harsh shadows across his face, making his expression seem even more severe than it was. A small crowd began to gather, the college students with their energy drinks, the dad with his toddler, and a few store employees who had stopped their closing duties to watch. The automatic doors kept trying to close and reopen, beeping softly with each attempt, adding an odd rhythm to the tense situation. "Officer," Maria began, keeping her voice steady and professional, "I just paid for everything in my cart. The cashier can verify that, and I have my receipt right here." She reached for the paper in her shopping bag, but Parker's reaction was immediate and unnecessary. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he demanded, his voice echoing through the store entrance. The toddler in the parking lot started crying, startled by the sharp tone. Several phones appeared in the growing crowd's hands, their cameras quietly recording the scene. Maria slowly placed both hands on her shopping cart handle, maintaining her composure despite the rising tension. "Officer Parker, I want to cooperate, but I need you to understand that your current behavior is inappropriate. I'd like to know what specific suspicious behavior you observed." Parker shifted his weight, clearly not expecting such a professional response. "You spent an unusual amount of time in the store, selecting large quantities of items. You were watching other customers and had multiple conversations that appeared to be attempting to establish cover." A few onlookers exchanged glances, recognizing the absurdity of these accusations. The young cashier who had rung up Maria's purchase stepped forward. "Sir, I just checked her out. Everything was paid for properly, and these are regular items we sell for events and parties." "Step back," Parker ordered the cashier, his voice carrying an edge that made everyone uncomfortable. The store manager, who had been called to the front by concerned employees, emerged from his office, taking in the scene with growing concern. Maria took a deep breath, recognizing the situation was spiraling unnecessarily. "Officer Parker, I understand you're doing your job, but you're making assumptions without cause. I'm happy to show you my receipt, but I need you to adjust your approach." Instead of de-escalating, Parker reached for his radio. "I'm going to need backup at Wilson's supermarket," he announced, despite no indication that backup was necessary. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, phones still recording, as people recognized the injustice unfolding before them. "This is ridiculous," someone in the crowd muttered, while others nodded in agreement. The store manager was now on his phone, his expression worried as he looked between Maria and Officer Parker. The situation had moved well beyond a simple receipt check and was quickly becoming a lesson in poor judgment and prejudice. Maria remained still, her mind racing through her years of training in conflict resolution. She could end this quickly by showing her badge, but something told her to let this play out a bit longer. Sometimes the best lessons came from allowing people to fully reveal their biases before addressing them. The evening air had grown cooler, but the atmosphere inside the store entrance was heating up with tension. Security cameras whirred overhead, capturing every moment. The cleaning crew had stopped their work entirely, standing near the customer service desk with concerned expressions. Officer Parker's backup would arrive soon, but not before the situation would take an unexpected turn. In the next few moments, everyone present would learn a powerful lesson about assumptions, authority, and the importance of treating every person with respect and dignity. The automatic doors had finally given up trying to close, remaining open to the parking lot where more curious onlookers had gathered. The scene was set for a revelation that would change perspectives and possibly even department policies. But first, this confrontation would need to reach its peak before the truth could bring everything into sharp, clear focus. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air as two patrol cars pulled into the parking lot, their lights painting the scene in alternating red and blue. Officer Parker stood a bit straighter, seemingly relieved by the backup. What he didn't realize was that this moment would become a turning point in his career, just not in the way he expected. "Now, ma'am," Parker said, his voice carrying a hint of satisfaction at the arriving backup, "we can deal with this situation properly." The crowd had grown larger, with some people whispering and shaking their heads at the unnecessary show of force for a simple shopping trip. Maria looked at the arriving officers and recognized them immediately. Officers Chen and Rodriguez from her own precinct. A slight smile crossed her face as she saw the recognition dawn in their eyes. The situation was about to change dramatically. "I think you're right, Officer Parker," Maria said calmly, reaching slowly into her purse. "Let's deal with this situation properly." Parker tensed at her movement, but before he could react, she pulled out her badge and ID, holding them up for everyone to see. "Sheriff Maria Thompson, Riverside County Sheriff's Department." The silence that followed was deafening. Officer Parker's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, the dawning realization of his massive error in judgment. The crowd erupted in gasps and murmurs, several people clapping at the revelation. Officers Chen and Rodriguez approached, both trying to hide their smiles. "Good evening, Sheriff," Officer Chen said respectfully, then turned to Parker. "Officer Parker, I believe you've just met our department head." The store manager rushed forward, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Sheriff Thompson, I am so sorry about this. We know you well here. You're always helping with community events. I should have come out sooner." Maria held up a hand gently. "No apologies needed, Mr. Wilson. This situation is actually a perfect example of why we need our community outreach programs." She turned to face Parker, whose complexion had turned notably pale. "These supplies are for tomorrow's youth mentorship event, Officer Parker. Perhaps you'd like to attend. It seems like it could be beneficial." The crowd's phones were still recording, capturing every moment of this revelation. The young cashier who had tried to explain earlier was now beaming with satisfaction. The dad with the toddler was explaining to his now calm child about how things aren't always what they seem. Officer Parker's radio crackled to life. Dispatch asking for an update on the situation. Officer Rodriguez took the call, explaining succinctly that there had been a misunderstanding and the situation was resolved. But everyone present knew this was more than just a simple misunderstanding. I apologize, Sheriff Thompson," Parker finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. The confidence and authority he had displayed earlier had completely evaporated. "I made assumptions that were incorrect and potentially harmful," Maria finished for him, her tone firm but not unkind. "And that's exactly what we need to address in our department and in our community." She looked around at the gathered crowd, seeing the mix of emotions on their faces: satisfaction, relief, and hope for change. The toddler, now curious rather than scared, pointed at Maria's badge and asked his father loudly, "Is she the boss?" causing several people to laugh, breaking the tension. Maria smiled and waved at the child, remembering why she had gone into law enforcement in the first place, to protect and serve everyone in her community. "Officer Parker," she said, turning back to him, "I'd like you to help me bring these supplies into the community center tomorrow morning. We can use this experience as a teaching moment for the kids, and maybe for all of us." Her words were met with nods of approval from the onlookers. The evening air had grown cooler, but the atmosphere had completely transformed. What had started as a tense confrontation had become a powerful lesson about prejudice, authority, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances. The security cameras continued to record, documenting a moment that would soon be used in training sessions across the department. As Officers Chen and Rodriguez helped load the supplies into Maria's car, the crowd began to disperse, many stopping to thank her for her handling of the situation. The store employees returned to their closing duties, now with an incredible story to share. And Officer Parker stood there, his worldview visibly shaken, beginning to understand the true meaning of protect and serve. Back at the police station, the events at Wilson's supermarket were already causing waves. The night shift dispatcher had barely finished logging the incident when her phone started ringing nonstop. Videos of the confrontation had spread quickly through local community groups, and the story was taking on a life of its own. In the station's main office, Police Chief Richardson sat at his desk, reviewing the footage from multiple angles: store security cameras, body cameras, and civilian recordings. Each view told the same story, and none of it looked good. His computer screen showed dozens of incoming emails from concerned citizens, and his phone hadn't stopped buzzing with notifications. "Play that section again," he told the tech specialist, pointing to Officer Parker's body camera footage. The crystal-clear audio captured every word of the confrontation, including the moment of revelation. The chief removed his glasses and rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. In his 30 years of service, he'd seen plenty of mistakes, but this one was going to need immediate attention. Down the hall, Officer Parker sat in the briefing room, still in uniform but looking considerably less confident than he had earlier that evening. The room felt smaller than usual, the fluorescent lights somehow harsher. Two internal affairs officers sat across from him, their expressions neutral as they reviewed his file on their tablets. "Walk us through your decision-making process," one of the IA officers asked, her pen poised over her notepad. "What specific behaviors caused your initial suspicion?" Each question made Parker sink lower in his chair as he realized how hollow his explanation sounded. Meanwhile, in another part of the building, Sheriff Thompson was finishing up an impromptu press statement. She'd chosen to address the situation head-on, turning it into a teaching moment rather than a scandal. "This incident," she explained to the gathered reporters, "highlights why we're implementing new training programs across all departments. It's not about pointing fingers, it's about recognizing our blind spots and doing better." The station's break room had become an unofficial gathering spot as officers from all shifts discussed the incident. The usual chatter about sports scores and weekend plans was replaced by serious conversations about bias and responsibility. A rookie officer was showing her partner the social media response on her phone. The video had already gotten thousands of views and shares. "Did you see how she handled it, though?" one veteran officer commented, pouring his third cup of coffee. "No shouting, no drama, just pure professionalism. That's the kind of leadership we need." Others nodded in agreement, the incident already becoming a lesson in how to handle difficult situations. Outside in the parking lot, local news vans had started to arrive, their satellite dishes reaching into the night sky. The department's public information officer was busy coordinating responses, her phone constantly lighting up with media requests. This story wasn't going to fade away quietly. Back in his office, Chief Richardson finished reviewing the final piece of footage and made his decision. He pressed the intercom button, send in the HR director and the training coordinator. This incident was going to lead to department-wide changes starting tonight. The night shift secretary was busy printing out dozens of copies of updated protocols and training schedules. Tomorrow's regular briefing would now include a special session on community relations and bias recognition. The printer hummed steadily as she thought about how quickly one incident could spark such significant changes. In the station's lobby, a group of community leaders had arrived for an emergency meeting. Among them was Mr. Wilson from the supermarket, still in his store uniform, carrying a USB drive with additional security footage. The Community Oversight Board members listened intently as he described what he'd witnessed. Officer Chen, who had responded to Parker's backup call, was now sitting at his desk writing his incident report. He paused occasionally, choosing his words carefully. This report would likely be read by many people and possibly used in future training sessions. He wanted to ensure every detail was accurate and objective. The clock on the wall showed nearly midnight, but the station was as busy as it would be at noon. Administrative staff had been called in, training schedules were being revised, and policy documents were being updated. What had started as a routine evening had transformed into a catalyst for change. In the parking lot, Sheriff Thompson finally headed to her car, tomorrow's community event supplies safely stored in the trunk. Her phone buzzed with a message, the youth center coordinator confirming that they could accommodate an additional training session before the regular program. Sometimes, she thought, the best teaching moments come from the most unexpected situations. The morning sun had barely risen when the consequences of last night's incident really began to unfold. Chief Richardson's office was already busy with activity, his computer screen filled with emails from police departments across the state. The video had gone viral overnight, but not in the way these videos usually did. "Look at these responses," he said to his assistant, scrolling through his inbox. 3 departments want to know about our upcoming training programs. They're seeing this as a teaching opportunity. His coffee sat untouched on his desk, growing cold as he focused on the task at hand. Down in the records department, 2 clerks were pulling Officer Parker's complete file. Every complaint, every incident report, every performance review from his entire career was being examined. One clerk noticed a pattern emerging, small notes about gut feelings and suspicious behavior that, when viewed together, painted a concerning picture. 5 similar complaints in the last year alone, the senior clerk muttered, adding another file to the growing stack. How did nobody notice this before? Her younger colleague shook her head, realizing how easy it was for patterns to go unnoticed until something big forced everyone to pay attention. In the department's training room, the morning briefing had turned into an open discussion. Officers from the night shift stayed past their clock-out time, sharing their thoughts with the incoming day shift. The usual jokes and casual conversation were replaced by serious discussions about community trust and personal responsibility. "I've been on the force for 20 years, one senior officer shared, his voice thoughtful. "And you know what? Sometimes it takes something like this to make us stop and really think about how we're doing our jobs." Heads nodded around the room as others shared similar reflections. Outside, local news crews were setting up for their morning broadcasts. The story had evolved overnight. It wasn't just about one incident anymore. It had become a conversation about change, about doing better, about turning a negative moment into positive action. Officer Parker sat in his car in the station parking lot, staring at the building he'd worked in for the past 3 weeks. His phone showed dozens of missed calls from family and friends who'd seen the video. The local news played on his car radio, discussing the incident and its implications for law enforcement training nationwide. Inside the station's conference room, the internal affairs team was conducting interviews with witnesses from the supermarket. The young cashier who had tried to intervene described the scene, her voice steady as she recalled how unnecessary the escalation had been. Mr. Wilson, the store manager, shared security footage showing Sheriff Thompson's regular visits for community events. "She's been shopping here for years," Mr. Wilson explained, pointing to older footage. "Always buying supplies for youth programs, always helping elderly customers with their groceries. That's the kind of officer she is." The IA investigators took detailed notes, building a comprehensive picture of the contrast between perception and reality. In the break room, officers gathered around a TV showing national news coverage of the incident. The story had caught attention not for the confrontation, but for how it was handled afterward. "They're calling it a model response," one officer commented. "Shows how doing the right thing can change the whole narrative." The department's phone lines were constantly ringing, not with complaints, but with questions about their training programs and community outreach initiatives. Other law enforcement agencies wanted to know how they could implement similar changes in their own departments. As the morning wore on, it became clear that the 5 minutes of confrontation at Wilson's supermarket had sparked something much bigger than anyone expected. What could have been another negative headline had instead become a catalyst for meaningful change, all because of how one person chose to handle a difficult situation with grace and wisdom. In the city hall across town, the mayor's office was drafting a statement. What could have been a public relations nightmare was instead becoming an example of positive institutional change. The mayor's aide read through Sheriff Thompson's initial response, noting how she'd managed to turn the incident into a constructive conversation about bias and community relations. Back at the station, the training coordinator was revising next month's schedule. "We're adding 2 new modules," she explained to her team. "One on conscious and unconscious bias, and another on community engagement. And we're bringing in experts from outside the department. We need fresh perspectives." The department's social media manager was having an unusually positive day. Instead of dealing with the usual negative comments, she was sorting through hundreds of supportive messages. Community members were sharing their own positive experiences with Sheriff Thompson, and local organizations were offering to partner with the department for future training programs. The community center buzzed with activity as kids and officers mingled in the bright morning light. The supplies from last night's shopping trip were spread across several tables, creating a welcoming atmosphere for the youth mentorship program. But today's event was different from previous ones. There was an extra lesson to be shared. Sheriff Thompson stood at the front of the room, watching as Officer Parker helped set up the last few chairs. He'd arrived early, wearing his civilian clothes as requested, ready to be part of something bigger than himself. The nervousness in his movements was visible, but so was his determination to learn and grow from yesterday's experience. "The snacks go on that table," Thompson directed a group of volunteer officers who were unpacking grocery bags from Wilson's supermarket. Mr. Wilson himself had donated additional supplies after last night's incident, turning a negative situation into extra support for the community program. The first group of kids started arriving, their excited chatter filling the room. Among them was the toddler from the supermarket, now holding his father's hand and pointing excitedly at Sheriff Thompson. "Look, Dad, it's the police boss lady." Several officers smiled at the child's enthusiasm. "Today, Sheriff Thompson began, addressing the gathered crowd of children, parents, and officers. We're going to talk about something very important: how we see each other, and how we can do better at understanding one another. She glanced at Parker, who nodded slightly, ready to be part of the lesson. The young cashier from Wilson's had come too, sitting in the back of the room. She'd asked for the morning off specifically to attend this event. Next to her sat several other community members who had witnessed last night's incident, all curious to see how this story would continue to unfold. Sometimes, Thompson continued, we make mistakes. We jump to conclusions without having all the facts. But what matters most is how we learn from those mistakes and what we do afterward. The room fell quiet, everyone listening intently to her words. Officer Parker stood up, his voice slightly shaky but growing stronger as he spoke. I made a mistake yesterday, he admitted to the room. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, but today I'm here to learn and to help others avoid making the same mistake. The children watched with curiosity as Parker and Thompson demonstrated different scenarios through role play, showing how quick judgments could be wrong. They involved the kids in exercises about looking beyond first impressions, turning a serious lesson into an engaging activity that had everyone participating. Remember, Thompson said as she handed out cookies to the Eva kids, a badge isn't what makes someone trustworthy, it's their actions and how they treat others. Parents nodded in agreement, some recording the session on their phones to share with friends and family. The local news crew, invited to document the event, captured moments of officers and children working together, solving problems, and learning from each other. This wasn't just damage control, it was genuine community building in action. In one corner, Officer Chen led a group discussion about communication and respect. The children shared their own experiences of being misjudged, their honest stories touching the hearts of every adult in the room. Even the most veteran officers found themselves learning from the wisdom of these young voices. The training coordinator moved through the room, taking notes for future programs. What had started as a response to an incident was evolving into a permanent part of their community outreach curriculum. Other departments had already reached out, asking to send observers to their next session. As the morning progressed, the atmosphere in the room transformed. What could have been an awkward, forced attempt at reconciliation instead became a genuine moment of community connection. Officers who had come out of obligation found themselves fully engaged, learning alongside the children they were meant to be teaching. Near the end of the session, Mr. Wilson arrived with fresh pastries for everyone. This is what community looks like, he said, watching officers and civilians mingling freely. We learn from our mistakes and grow stronger together. Sheriff Thompson looked around the room with satisfaction. The security cameras that had captured last night's confrontation were now recording something very different: hope, change, and progress. Her phone buzzed with messages from other departments asking about implementing similar programs. As the event wound down, parents and children thanked the officers, many stopping to take photos and share contact information for future programs. Officer Parker stood by the door, shaking hands and having honest conversations with community members who just yesterday might have seen him very differently. The last child to leave was the toddler from the supermarket. He gave Sheriff Thompson a high five and then, to everyone's surprise, gave one to Officer Parker too. See you next time, he called out, demonstrating the innocent ability of children to forgive and move forward. In the end, what could have been just another viral video of confrontation had instead become a story of transformation, proof that with the right leadership and willingness to learn, even the most challenging moments could lead to positive change in the community.